If you are someone, let's say over the age of 50, and you suspect that you have ADHD, but you're not entirely sure whether it's even worth it to pursue a diagnosis, then today's video is for you. Because this actually comes up a lot for me. The majority of people that are in my ecosystem are my age, and a lot of them are older. But a lot of you think, well, at this stage in the game, is it worth it for me to actually do something about it? And the reason I have avoided responding to this question is that if I don't know who you are, what your circumstance is, whatever I say might not be helpful. I don't know if you have access to the appropriate diagnostic resources. And if you did get a diagnosis, maybe you don't have access to the support you might want or need to do something about it. However, the question keeps coming up, and I do think it's a really important conversation to have. So consider this a conversation starter. Take everything I say with a grain of personal salt, because obviously it's not going to apply to everyone universally. Everyone's situation is different. So the more we can share our collective experiences, the better we can help each other make the best decisions for ourselves. So on that note, let's get into it. But before we do, if you're new here, welcome. My name is Karen McGill. I am an ADHD coach and creator. I personally was diagnosed after the age of 50, and I am personally very glad that I did. So let's kick this conversation off with the most recent question I got in response to my Sunday setup email. Somebody wrote, "My current issue is deciding whether or not to get diagnosed. It would be helpful to get your take on the pros and cons of a diagnosis. I'm a 68-year-old male, retired, and living in the US." So my response would be to flip that question around and ask instead, if I suspected that I had ADHD, regardless of my age, why wouldn't I go ahead and get a diagnosis? For the same reason that if I thought I had cancer or a broken leg, I would absolutely seek a diagnosis. Because here's the thing, just because you can't see it or point to it doesn't mean it's not there. Just because you can't see mental suffering doesn't mean that mental suffering doesn't exist. Now, a lot of mature adults with many years behind them might say, well, what's the point? I'm not going to change. It's not going to make a big difference. And to that, I'd call total BS. Instead of thinking, I'm too old, I've got too many years behind me and very few ahead of me, what's the point? You need to flip that script. Yes, you may have fewer years ahead of you than you do behind you, but don't you want those precious years to be as good as they possibly can be? I feel very passionate about this because both of my parents died very young. My dad died at 43. My mom died at 63. So they didn't have the privilege of living to 68 and wondering whether or not there's something they could do to improve their lot in life. They died. So if you are 68 or 88, I don't care. If you have time in front of you, if you've been given the privilege of more life, why wouldn't you want to make that as good as it could possibly be? Not only for yourself, but for your kids and your grandkids. Don't you want them to see you living the best quality of life so they have a role model? Not only that, but if you confirm a diagnosis now, what we know is that ADHD has about a 70% heritability rate. That means that your kids and their kids who might be struggling with the same thing, but have never possibly considered that it could be ADHD, which also happens to be the most treatable mental health disorder there is. So with that said, coming back to your original question of whether or not it's worth it, I hope I've just outlined a couple of really strong pros, not to mention the fact that ADHD tends to have comorbidity. So there could be underlying anxiety and depression, OCD, maybe autism, who knows? Wouldn't you want to know those things now so that you can address them and not only live a better quality life, but possibly a longer life? Because we also know that folks with ADHD, especially undiagnosed ADHD, tend to have shorter lifespans, up to 20 years, because of impulsivity and poor lifestyle choices. So these are all extremely high value pros for getting a diagnosis, no matter how old you are. So now that we've covered some pretty big pros in terms of getting a diagnosis, no matter how old you are, now let's cover the cons. Obviously, the most important being accessibility. It can be very expensive to get a diagnosis depending on where you are. I'm here in the US, and at the time that I got my diagnosis, I had really good healthcare, so I basically had no out-of-pocket cost, which is great, but is obviously not the case for everyone. And since you mentioned you're here in the US, you're obviously eligible for Medicare. So I did a little Googling, and apparently Medicare Part B covers psychiatric evaluations. Now, I am not a Medicare expert, so I don't know if there's more out-of-pocket costs, but it is at least worth exploring what the costs might be. Now, in other countries, it might be a completely different ballgame. The process might be free, but there might be a long waiting list, which is fine. Put your name on any waiting list you can, because the time is going to pass anyways, and you can continue looking for other ways to get a diagnosis sooner. The point here is to decide first that it's worth getting a diagnosis, and then go down the rabbit hole of finding the best possible course of action to actually get the diagnosis. The other thing I want to address in terms of not getting a diagnosis is this idea of a stigma. So if you actually formally get a diagnosis, then you have this thing and other people are going to think that you are less than. I don't know where you live or who you surround yourself with, but I can assure you that in these parts, on this channel, in this community, there is no stigma. There is absolutely no thinking lesser than if you have ADHD, autism, if you have 4 legs instead of 2. There is no stigma. So the stigma that you are thinking of is either self-constructed, or you've actually had conversations with people who have negative opinions about folks with ADHD. And if that is the case, that you're afraid of what other people might think, then you don't have to tell them. It can be our little secret that you got a diagnosis and you got treated and you're feeling better and you're doing better at life, and nobody ever needs to be the wiser. And of course, I'm always going to be over here rooting for you to be open and honest about a diagnosis, because there is no shame and there's nothing wrong with it. And you might help somebody else by sharing your story, which is why I'm here. And the only way we can share our stories is if we're willing to be open about it. But of course, that's your decision. If you're in a situation where it could hinder your career or anything like that, then you might just want to keep it to yourself. But the thing to remember here is if you get a diagnosis and you get proper treatment, then you are going to show up better in your career. You're going to show up better in your relationships. You're going to follow through on more. You're going to be less reactive. You're going to be more focused, and you're going to have a better quality of life overall. So whether you decide to tell people or not, remember, the outcome of getting a diagnosis and proper treatment is only going to improve your situation. So those are the pros and cons that I would think about if I were deciding whether or not to get a diagnosis. If there's other pros and cons that you can think of, again, I would love for you to leave them in the comments so we can make this a holistic conversation. There's one other question I get a lot that's related to this conversation, and that is it worth it to go through the process of formally getting diagnosed if I suspect that I have it? Should I just act as if and go on accordingly? So basically, can I just self-diagnose? And I think everybody's going to have different opinions about this. If you suspect you have ADHD, but for whatever reason you don't want to get a diagnosis, I would learn everything I could about it. Watch videos like this, read books, learn from the medical experts, and see where your specific challenges map to the disorder. And then look at what experts recommend in order to cope with those challenges. You don't need a formal label to improve any area of your life. So whether you struggle with planning an organization or self-regulation, any of those things, you can map where your specific struggles are to what experts suggest, and then practice those behaviors until you see improvements in your life without ever having to self-diagnose yourself. That's my 2 cents on whether or not you should get a diagnosis. I hope some of that was helpful. Again, feel free to continue this conversation in the comments. Please keep it kind. And on that note, I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.